Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Red, and I am the moderator for this session, which is called Protecting Self and Others from Criminalization. And we will be hearing from Dartricia Rollins from Charis Books and More, Naomi Destabel from Feminist Women's Health Center, and Allison Coffman from Amplify, Georgia. We are, of course, just so grateful to have these speakers here and to just soak up this knowledge, which is just increasingly important. And as a reminder, please use the chat to, converse, to ask questions. And we are here if you need anything. So I'm going to hand it over to Allison.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to kick us off so that we have plenty of time to cover all the content that we are wanting to cover today. So our first speaker is, sorry, I'm pulling up, oh, of course, I'm blocking the slides now. Our first speaker is Dartricia Rollins. Dartricia is a queer Southern organizer and cultural worker. Dartricia is the assistant director of Charis Circle and a bookseller at Charis Books and More. She serves on the board of directors of Access Reproductive Care Southeast and is a member of the Black Alliance for Peace and the PSL. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dartricia. I'm going to hand it over to you and just encourage folks, as we get into the presentation, to just introduce yourselves in the chat and share a little bit about why you are interested in this topic. Right, over to you, Dartricia.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so I will be grounding us in the history of criminalization. So first and foremost, it is important for us to think of and understand history as something that is being shaped and created daily and is being informed by our actions or inactions. And it is not useful for us to think about history as something only of the past. And it has to be studied and understood as something that shapes our futures. And so I will start with this. This country, the United States of America, is a settler colony founded on the theft and genocide of Native people and the theft and enslavement of African peoples and their labor. And so we love doing land acknowledgements at our social justice events, but that means exactly nothing if we're not doing so without the express intention that Native people can, should, and will get their land back, as they are still fighting the settler colonial state right now with that express intention. And when they do, that is, struggle and fight for their land back, they are murdered, jailed, and disappeared. I will repeat, when people fight for their liberation, they are jailed, making them into criminals, murdered, continuing genocidal practices, or disappeared. And so we cannot understand the history of criminalization and the invention and creation of criminals in this settler colonial state without this at the top of our minds, because we betray ourselves and our liberation movements when we legitimize this white supremacist state and government, when we follow their rules and their talking points about crime and who perpetuates it. I would be remiss if I did not mention, before I get into it, that this month is also Black August, which is not a celebration of just simply being Black in the month of August. It is a month of commemoration of Black political prisoners and freedom fighters who were and still are jailed, murdered, and disappeared for fighting for the exact liberation and freedom that we all say we want. This is important, as I will mention later, because Black August comes out of the Black liberation movements of the 70s, which, if you remember, was a time of all kinds of liberation movements, including the women's liberation movement that militantly fought for Roe v. Wade, demanding our right to access to safe and legal abortions. And so when I say that the United States invents criminals, I quite literally mean it. When thinking about the history and growth of prisons and a criminal population, it is important to remember that this white supremacist state creates laws and therefore criminals whenever it sees fit. The same way abortion was legal, or at least not criminalized, then made lawfully criminal, then made lawfully legal by the passing of Roe, and now here we are back to legal with the overturning of Roe, should prove to you that crime is an invention and is a tool of oppression and state repression. And repression can be defined as the action of subduing someone or something by force. And so I think many of us know the narrative of slave catchers that became police officers, but it is important to know the in-between. So what took place between the end of slavery, the end of the Civil War, and the beginning of Jim Crow? which is the Black Reconstruction era, which the great socialist scholar W.B. Du Bois describes as the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery, in one of his most famous books, Black Reconstruction in America. The Reconstruction era lasted between 1860 through 1880, giving former enslaved Black people the first real freedoms they had ever experienced since arriving on this land as captured and brutalized labor. But that brief moment of freedom did not come without great repression from the capitalist North and the ex-slave owning South. And so in the book Shackled and Chained, Eugene Puryear writes, a series of laws called Black Codes specify what occupations were open to the now free Black population. They declared that those who failed to sign yearly labor contracts could be arrested and hired out to white landowners. He goes on to write, the Black Codes, while functioning through the criminal justice system as part of the state, did not exist primarily to put people in prison institutions. On the contrary, they existed to recreate a class of subjugated labor to maintain Blacks working principally in the plantation and service economy. Those Black codes brought about things like vagrancy laws, which is important when we discuss who gets criminalized. And that brings me to my next point. So who was criminalized? I cannot and will not do this topic justice in the short amount of time that I have. But if you missed my previous points, Black people were criminalized, working class and poor Black men and women, to be precise. And so vagrancy laws were greatly impacted Black women and categorized them as wayward. In an article written by Grace B. Campbell, she writes about how vagrancy laws and accusations of prostitution disproportionately criminalized vulnerable Black women and forced them into workhouses. Again, free labor. This was a time before the growth and expansion of prisons. So the next best thing was the workhouse that basically served as the same role as a prison. Women could be charged with vagrancy in jail for living alone. Literally, women could go to jail for being single, for being seen drinking with men, for cussing, or whatever bullshit reason given by the police and the courts. We also saw the largest increase in policing and state repression during the Black liberation movement. And so Eugene Puryear writes of the ushering in of the law and order brought to us by the Nixon administration. This right-wing campaign for law and order was not just one of words. It had real consequences, which included, 1, a full-scale crackdown on revolutionary organizations like the Black Panther Party. 2, the rapid expansion and militarization of police forces. That's how we got things like SWAT and the 1033 program, which gives states funding to militarize their police. You know, like the tanks that we saw when we were out protesting in 2020. And 3, dramatic spending increases in corrections, literally building more prisons to warehouse poor people, people addicted to drugs, people with mental health conditions, and revolutionaries. And 4, the erosion of the liberal response to urban crime. That is, liberals regurgitating things like the super predator nonsense brought to you by your favorite white feminist Hillary Clinton. These factors will ultimately pave the way towards the mass incarceration boom. So, I will reiterate that the proliferation of mass incarceration came as a direct response to revolutionary groups like the Black Panther Party, who struggled against police brutality and created social programs such as the free breakfast programs that we love to celebrate today. And why? Because the United States does not want to stop killing Black people. It's pretty simple. The United States has to subjugate Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, queer people and women, and people of the global South in order to maintain its hegemony and concentrated wealth. And so my next point will get to what we're facing currently. So we all of us here at the summit, have the potential of becoming or being made into criminals. We have come here with the intention to learn, organize, and fight back against the outlawing of abortion. And so it is important to know what we're up against. After a summer of slogans of defund the police are literally being funded. And that funding is coming as a direct result of the uprisings of 2020. Because if you remember my previous points, the police are a tool of repression. They're a tool of the ruling class to make sure that you and I do not fight for or win our rights. And right here in Atlanta, they're using that funding and the funding from private foundations such as the Atlanta Police Foundation, which is made up of wealthy people and corporations, to build a mock cop city. The foundation, in collaboration with local elected officials, has been instrumental in the effort to establish a new public safety training program or center, also known as Cop City, to be located across 150 acres of the old Atlanta prison farm. This training facility, larger than 85 NFL football fields combined, would include shooting ranges, spaces for militarized drills, and a mock city complete with buildings and roads to allow the Atlanta Police Department to practice urban warfare tactics, including bomb testing and tear gas deployment. Why do the police need bomb testing? Who are they planning to bomb? I guess it's us if we take to the streets again. And who did they use that tear gas against? Us again. Why? For saying no more to the police killings of Black people. So, the new Cop City training facility is yet another massive militarized and corporate funded project that the Police Foundation is trying to prop up behind closed doors, and it is our duty to fight it. Also, did you know that Atlanta is the most surveilled city in the United States? The Atlanta Police Foundation is also capitalizing on this narrative of increased crime and sowing distrust amongst us and our neighbors. I obviously cannot see everyone that's in this room today, but I do wonder how many people here have Ring cameras on their homes. Through programs such as Operation Shield, which is a network of advanced technologies that creates more efficient policing, including a citywide network of surveillance cameras and license plate readers, predictive policing platform, and criminal analytics software, a line taken directly from the APF website. Through Operation Shield, police officers view footage captured by the foundation's privately owned cameras. That is, all of the citizens who have enthusiastically agreed to give them access to link their home and business cameras to the larger network of police cameras. When the initiative was announced in September 2011, authorities had access to about 100 public and private cameras. Today, in 2022, it is nearly 12,000, and that number is growing every single day. And so I took a walk through my neighborhood recently, and many of my neighbors have fallen prey to these tactics and have installed cameras all over their homes. And I live in a working class Black neighborhood, and I've been here for 6 years, and I've never heard of any crimes taking place here, but everybody has a camera now. And so what do you think the police are doing with these cameras and predictive policing platforms? How exactly do you predict crime? You don't. You manufacture and you create it. And this should be of concern to us. And so as reproductive justice advocates, we have to understand the history that shapes the world that we live in. We have to be vigilant and say no more to cops in this country. We have to say no more to prisons in this country, because as I've stated before, abortion was once legal, and that is becoming increasingly untrue. And if you think that will just stop at a 6-week abortion ban in Georgia and locking up doctors who perform abortions, you're gravely mistaken. And by the time you catch up, it'll be too late. So I've included a resource list of books and podcasts to help you all study up on things I briefly mentioned here today, and so much more about the history of policing. We must see our struggles as linked, and we must organize against all forms of oppression. And so I will leave you all with this quote. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. That quote is from a German pastor who was originally a Nazi sympathizer who spent 8 years in Nazi Germany camp after becoming outspoken after the rise of Hitler. And so don't wait for them to come for you. Now, if any, is a time to fight, and keep fighting until we are all truly liberated. Our collective liberation will not come from reforms or manifesting And we will not see it under this capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist state. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dartricia, for your brilliance and grounding us in what criminalization is, who has been criminalized, and how here in Georgia we are perpetuating criminalization and propping up and investing in this system of policing to further criminalize folks, because that gives us a lot of great context for the conversations we're going to be having now around self-managed abortion and opportunities for criminalization and to protect ourselves from criminalization, and then online talking about opportunities for criminalization and increased safety. And everyone, I encourage you to please look at the resource list that Dartricia put together. If there's one person I could ask to create a reading list for me on any topic, it would be Dartricia. So we are really lucky to have a resource list crafted by her specifically on this topic. So the next speaker is Naomi Destabel. Naomi is an artist, writer, and social justice advocate based in Atlanta, Georgia, by way of Ethiopia. She works in the intersection of education, outreach, and community development in East Africa, Central America, and the United States, with a passion centered in the interconnection of maternal health and rights, reproductive justice, and refugee resettlement. She is currently the community outreach manager at Feminist Women's Health Centers in Atlanta, where through her role, she supports community-based engagement and movement building programs within the organization. She also speaks 4 languages, adores her cats, and enjoys traveling. Thank you so much for joining us, Naomi.
Hey, Allison, thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm here to speak a little bit about self-managed abortion with you all today. And we're going to kick off with discussing exactly what is self-managed abortion. This is a hot topic that's come up right now. We're hearing it in a lot of spaces. Self-managed abortion broadly refers to non-clinical abortion, or abortion that happens outside of the formal healthcare system and without the involvement of a medical professional. Self-managed abortion is not a back alley abortion or a do-it-yourself abortion. It's an abortion that happens most commonly in someone's home, done in privacy and safety, and often with the help and support of a friend or a loved one. I think that when we hear about SMA, it's often spoken about in the context of someone being alone, but oftentimes there is a doula or a friend that supports someone. And when discussing SMA, we like to move away from problematic language around coat hangers or back alley, because this speaks to a different time and landscape in SMA. Currently, most SMA is done with mifepristone or misoprostol pills. These are the same medications given to folks in the clinic. There are different ways that a person might choose to self-induce an abortion, but self-managing is the safest and most effective option according to the World Health Organization. In fact, the World Health Organization has a whole website for resources and information on SMA. And there are 2 ways to go about performing SMA. The first method is a combination of medications that I just mentioned, Mifi and Miso, and the other is using Miso only. What these medications do is stop a pregnancy from growing. They cause cramping and bleeding to empty the uterus, and this is also known as medication abortion. For folks who joined us for Abortion 101 earlier, you heard me go through the process of medication versus surgical abortion. These are the exact same medications used that folks would access in a clinic. The only difference is that folks are using it in the privacy of their own home. The instructions that folks would receive for utilizing these pills at home are the same information that they would receive in a hospital or in a clinical setting. If folks were to choose to use the method that is with Mifi and Miso, this has a 95 to 99% effective rate. If folks were to choose the second method, it has a 75 to 85% effective rate. Most folks will use the first method, but either or works for folks depending on their access and their level of comfortability. When it comes to protecting yourself, it's really important that folks know that if a person needs to go to the hospital after having a self-managed abortion, it's important for them to go and get the care that they need. All they have to do is say that they're having a miscarriage. There's no way for medical experts to tell the difference. Now, a lot of the times there is a lot of stigma and fear around SMA, but in order for doctors to be able to test if an abortion was indeed self-managed or a miscarriage, it's a little bit of a process for them to even go through that. And providers are not going to often request that information up front. Usually people end up sharing that information unknowingly or even out of a state of fear. And so before one is self-managing or before one is advising someone that they love about self-managing, it's important to keep in mind if there's a medical emergency, just keep in mind when going to a hospital to just say that it's a miscarriage. And if one has any questions or concerns around that time period, there's a free resource from the Repro Legal Helpline in partnership with If One How that provides free legal support and advice. Their phone number and website is listed here on the slide and also in the resource deck that you all receive afterwards. Now we're going to speak a little bit about the risks of SMA. Now, a small number of people have been unfairly arrested or jailed for using abortion pills that were obtained on their own. In most of these cases, the charges were ultimately dropped or the person wasn't found guilty. However, we have to admit that the risk of criminalization is a real one. People who self-manage their abortions may risk unjustified arrest and imprisonment under laws that require the abortion pills be given by licensed healthcare workers and criminalize self-induced abortion. So a person thinking about doing this or their support person should be very careful not to talk to law enforcement about their plans, as it could have legal consequences for everyone involved. And when I share this information with folks, I take it a step further and say that folks should be really careful about not sharing this information with folks who are in close contact with law enforcement. And we'll go into this a little bit later, but this includes folks like probation officers or social workers who are themselves often required to communicate that sort of information. Some misused laws to punish self-managed abortion that we've seen include fetal harm laws. These were laws that were actually designed to protect pregnant people from harm, but we've seen these laws be used against pregnant people themselves. When the law isn't clear, it can be used against a pregnant person instead of protecting them. Abortion provision laws determine under what circumstances an abortion can be provided, or trap laws that restrict how a clinic can provide services. And these laws define when and to whom abortion care can be provided. General laws that restrict who can practice medicine or dispense medicine. People who help someone self-manage or obtain pills have been charged, we've seen, for practicing medicine or violating pharmaceutical laws. And lastly, drug possession. Because MISI and MIFO are still hard to access in the US, they are prescription medication, there are laws about who can dispense it, what makes a prescription valid, and for what purpose a prescription is valid. Now, because of this stigma associated around abortion, there is a belief amongst some that SMA is inherently wrong, and this is how this idea is used to take laws that were never intended to be used against someone who's self-managed against them. And these are some laws to keep in mind. Now, Dartricia just grounded us in a really great setting around criminalization and folks who are more likely to be criminalized. We're just going to touch on this a little bit more. Folks who have marginalized identities, including young folk, immigrants, refugees, folks experiencing economic insecurity, survivors of violence, BIPOC folks, or folks at the intersection of these marginalized identities, often experience the highest risk of criminalization for their abortion. Now, in order for us to understand criminalization, we have to recognize that risk is not absolute. Oftentimes, I think when we're in trainings like these, folks want to know what are exact numbers or percentages, but we can't provide that exact information. Because we often hear of SMA in the news in the context of a worst case scenario, when someone has already been arrested or has had a medical emergency and is blasted on the news, we often see a really skewed view of SMA, and criminalization feels like a very high risk. But in truth, that's not the case. In terms of the results that we know of, based on how many people research SMA and order pills, we see that many people are self-managing safely and successfully and in privacy without ever coming into the attention of law enforcement or in the attention of the media. Now, there are further factors that increase criminalization. We just went over some of those discriminatory factors that include marginalization. like race, poverty, and immigration. And there are also discretionary factors. These include the specific law where someone lives, what the specific prosecutor involved may want to do, whether or not a person is in close proximity with people who are close to law enforcement. So this takes us back to probation officers or social workers, people that we know have a history of working closely with police and are likely to start reports and investigations into people. Some risky legal territory includes directing people to websites and information that connect them to resources outside of the US. These include Plan C or aid access. These are spaces that work with doctors outside of the United States, or getting legal or medical advice when one is not licensed to do so, or information sharing in a way that presents an immediate solution. This type of counseling could increase legal risk for both oneself and the person receiving information if they're acting in a way that's different than they would have without one's input, or advising people on what they may need. Example, telling someone that they should have an abortion instead of emergency contraception, or telling people what their legal risks are. Some best practices for supporting someone through a self-managed abortion include listening, validating, referring, and describing research. As a support person, you're free to talk about abortion services that exist elsewhere. You can refer people to states outside of where one is based locally. You can provide general information about SMA. You can give detailed information about the pills commonly used. You're free to share information from the World Health Organization and the protocol for taking those medications. And you can also give publicly trusted resources that are safe to share, including that people have been safely self-managing for some time. You may share if there is a level of legal risk involved. An example is, say someone says to you, I can't get an abortion at my local clinic, but I found a website where I can order pills online for $90. I'm worried about getting into legal trouble. If I get the pills, what should I do? Avoid giving any sort of specific answer along the lines of, it's possible you could get into legal trouble in your state, have someone else order the pills for you, hide the packages, don't tell anyone. It's best to instead say, I'm sorry, but that's a question I can't answer. If you need legal advice, you can contact the reprolegalhelpline.org. From there, someone will be connected to a trusted and vetted guide and resource who will provide them with all of the information that they need, access, and pills. That protects you and the person needing care, ensuring that they're able to get what they need and that you're also able to support them through that process as their support person. Some common questions that people have are, can I share historical information as an example instead of a straightforward answer when providing SMA support? And yes, that is absolutely okay, as long as it's only information. As we've discussed, folks have been self-managing safely for quite some time, and there's a load of information that provides this fact. You can share as much as you would like about that. Another common question is, do I always need to use third-person language when discussing SMA? This isn't exactly where you'd get into legally risky territory. It's more about the content of information being shared. So if you were giving information that was very specific in the content and you were still using third-person language, it wouldn't protect you legally. What if someone is considering going to the hospital for medical help after a miscarriage? Unfortunately, we know that quite often it is the medical provider themselves getting law enforcement involved. But the truth is, a lot of times medical providers themselves don't know that they don't have to report. Sometimes it's out of an abundance of caution on their end. Because of so much stigma and fear and confusion around abortion, we find that medical providers themselves are unsure about what it is they have to say and don't have to say. This is why we encourage folks who are choosing to self-manage or interested in self-managing or being a support person to choose to say that one is having a miscarriage, so that this protects oneself from any confusion with a medical provider passing on any information to law enforcement. When engaging with medical providers, it's really important to state that if someone's having a medical emergency after their SMA, they should go to the doctor. Absolutely go to the hospital. The person seeking medical care should simply be careful not to say that they've used any pills. Again, just to state that they've had a miscarriage. There is not currently any test that can identify abortion pills in blood or in urine. As long as a person doesn't have the pills on or in their mouth or vagina, there's no way for a doctor or a nurse to know that they use the pills at all. The treatment that the doctors would provide is exactly the same whether the miscarriage is natural or caused by medication. These are important points for us to share with folks because we want to make sure that people know that self-managing abortion is something that is safe, that is common, that's been going on for a very long time, and folks will continue to self-manage their abortions. There's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of conversation going on around this, and there are many resources that we have provided for you all in our resource folder for how to access pills, for how to connect with legal support, and for how to find support groups and campaigns that are working to demystify and destigmatize this information. If you are interested in being a support person, or if you are interested in supporting this work that folks are already doing, there's a lot of ways for you to get plugged in, either locally or digitally or on the ground. And I would be really happy to share further information with any folks that are interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. You covered so much useful content, always getting questions about self-managed abortion and criminalization. And I think you touched on all the different topics and gave people really clear resources of where they can learn more. And I've been seeing some questions in the chat. I think some folks have been responding in real time. There was one specific question about criminalization in restrictive states around miscarriage. And I know Naomi shared the Repro Healthline, and we also put a chat in there. They're a really great resource for free legal support, and they will activate if somebody needs more than just a consultation and will need like more ongoing legal support. So they're a really great resource for people who are experiencing that criminalization in real time or have questions about potential risk. Awesome.
Sorry, I wanted to add just one last thing.
Yeah.
At the Feminist Women's Health Center, where I serve as the community outreach manager, we're going to be launching a series of trainings on self-managed abortion. This will be starting sometime next month. So for any folks that might be interested on getting a little bit more info, I will share my information on our website in the chat, and please feel free to follow up with me. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. And you can be trained and become a community educator, right? And resource on self-management.
Yes, absolutely. Folks can be trained as a community health worker through our program and actually support in training other trainers. So if this is something that folks would like to get plugged into, there's a lot of opportunities.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Naomi. And I'm seeing, just keeping track of the chats. Looks like folks are interested in learning more. This is freaking awesome. Yay. Yeah. And there's so much more to be learned and shared. And what I love about this work is it really is community led. So definitely recommend y'all getting in touch with Naomi. Great. So I'm going to transition us into talking about criminalization online. But before I do that, I actually wanted to make one more comment about a person in the chat had put a question about the personhood provision in our law. So as Naomi shared, our current law does not explicitly criminalize self-managed abortion, right? Almost all of the bans and restrictions that we currently have target providers and their criminalization. But that doesn't mean that laws haven't been and won't be used to criminalize people for self-managing, like ones around fetal remains or disposal of fetal remains and the other lists that Naomi shared. The personhood piece is still a major unknown, right? So for those who don't know, the new law redefined person under Georgia's law as to include a fetus and an embryo. And so there has been a lot of speculation around how a law like that could be used to criminalize people for either self-managing their own abortion, getting an abortion, supporting people to have an abortion. And the reality is that we don't yet know how those laws are going to be applied. So until we are sure that they will be applied to explicitly criminalize folks, we're kind of operating under like a wait and see approach, but acknowledging that there could be increased criminalization risk because of that unknown. So that's just for people to be aware of. We don't have a lot of time to I don't want to go into vast speculation about how those laws could be applied, but it's definitely something that a lot of folks are talking about right now. And we're going to be continuing to do a lot of work around moving forward. All right, so let me reshare my screen. Okay, so protecting ourselves and others from criminalization online. So I wanted to start off this presentation just by talking a little bit about, like, one, there is no way to completely eliminate your risk of criminalization, but there are things that we can do to decrease the likelihood. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about digital security, but I want to note that operational security is just as important piece of the equation when we're talking about increased safety, right? Because we can shore up all of our information online, and if we disclose to the wrong person or to that healthcare worker or to that social worker that we may have broken the law or managed their own abortion or done something else, then they can take that information and report it to the police, and we can be criminalized for that, even if we've shored up all of our digital information. If When How, who runs the Repro Legal Healthline and does a lot of research and legal work around self-managed abortion, actually recently released a report illustrating how most people are criminalized. And it isn't for Googling self-managed abortion. It isn't for like tracking their periods in an app. It's often reported by folks, sometimes trusted people, that are like bringing this information to the police. And then their phones are confiscated, their digital records are searched, that sort of thing. So it often starts with the operational security piece and then goes into the digital piece. All right, so there are kind of like three core buckets that we need to think about when we're talking about protecting our digital security. So the first thing is protecting our browsing history, right? So one simple thing we can do is we can be more diligent about clearing our browsing history. Every browser we use is a little bit different, but you can pretty easily clear the history and make sure that somebody else who comes on the computer isn't able to see what websites you've been accessing. You can also use a Tor, which allows you to search without the tracking that most search engines have. There's also DuckDuckGo, which there are certain browsers that do not do as much tracking and collection of data. So you can also just default to using those browsers rather than Chrome or Safari or something like that. You can also browse in an incognito window for searches that you don't want people to be able to then pull up. And then one way that you can actually much more systematically protect your information is by setting up your own VPN. Virtual private network, I think is what it stands for. But basically, you log into a VPN, and rather than your IP address being on everything you're doing online, it is tagging a VPN. So it makes all of your information fully encrypted. It takes some time, a little bit of time, a little bit of work to set up a VPN. But once you do, it's kind of going on seamlessly in the background. All of this information I'm sharing with you all today is from the Digital Defense Fund. They're an incredible organization that specifically talks about digital security and abortion access. So if I'm going to be sharing their resources at the end of this and in our resource folder at the end of the summit. But they have a really great step-by-step guide explaining what a VPN is, how to set one up. But one thing they note is that you really do need to use a paid VPN and be very intentional about which one you pick, because if it isn't paid, they are selling your data. So you can set up a VPN that is not a good VPN. So it's really important that you're doing your due diligence and making sure that that is set up correctly and you're using the right one, but then it'll do a lot to protect your browsing history and information. Another important thing to do is to protect your device. So one simple thing we can all probably do better is, and rather than having like 1, 2, 3, 4 as our login pins for our phone, just make sure you set up something a little bit longer, a little bit more complex, that'll be harder for somebody to guess, like law enforcement. Another thing you can do is turn off location sharing on your device so that folks can't track where you are. For example, that you're going to a pharmacy or that you're going to a clinic, and use Firefox Focus instead of your phone's default browser to make sure that information isn't being tracked on your phone. And then another thing that is really important to note is that you do not need to hand your phone over to law enforcement unless they have a warrant. So if a law enforcement officer ask for your phone. Unless they have a warrant, do not turn it over. That's one way that law enforcement often gets access to people's phone information. And then the next big thing is protecting your communication. I think this is probably the piece that most of us are familiar with. I'll speak for myself. Signal, like I feel like it has gotten into the water that many of our text messaging platforms, like Facebook message, Instagram message, any of those are not, even WhatsApp, are not protected. So it's really important for us when we're sharing sensitive communications to be using a fully encrypted chat. Same for our emails. All of that information is being saved and collected and can be turned over to law enforcement unless it is fully encrypted. And something else you can do for added protection is turn on disappearing messages. Something we don't often talk about is that people in our lives, right, can also be perpetrators of violence. So if you are in a violent relationship and maybe they know the password to your phone and you have an encrypted messaging app set on your phone, but they aren't set to disappear, like that person is going to be able to get into your messages, or maybe this is a minor's parents. So it's important to remember who has access to my phone, even if it's encrypted, preventing external folks from getting into it. People in my life might still be able to read my messages. And so I need to be really intentional about that. And then some other like best practices around security that I know we've all heard a lot about, but I still think are worth reiterating because they are simple but highly effective and important. One is to just make sure we have strong passwords. Oftentimes we think like information gets online because like there are these high-tech hackers who like trick us into sharing our information. And I mean, the reality is many of us reuse our passwords. We have incredibly weak passwords. And that's how people access our accounts and can get our information. So a resource that Digital Defense Fund shares and that I have used in the past, and it's actually really fun to use, is howsecureismypassword.net. I encourage folks to like take that take that resource now, put it into your browser and just like type in some of your passwords or something like your password and just see how strong it is. Something that I used to think made a password strong is that it was random. So it would be like HQ, capital I, period, W, lowercase x, capital T, exclamation mark. Like that's super strong because like nobody would guess that. And that's actually not the truth. The best passwords are the longest passwords. So what this site will do is it'll say how long it would take for a computer to like randomly test all of these different passwords before it was able to get your password. So the longer it is, the more it'll take. Like it could take like 100,000 years for a particularly long one. Or much, much more time than that. And something they say that you can also do is use a phrase, right? So you could do like purple monkey, pink washing machine. That would be a really strong password and is much easier for me to remember. Another thing that helps, and the only reason why I have strong, unique passwords is because I use a password manager. So there are password managers like 1Password. I use LastPass. That allow you to generate new passwords for each of the sites you use, and then they save it. And then you have just one single like kind of master password that you use to log into LastPass. And then if you add it to your browsers on your phone and your computer, then they can autofill. It is important that you still make it so you have to put in the LastPass password. Otherwise, if it's just autofilling all your passwords, then anybody who has access to your computer or to your phone would then have all the autofill. But it's really helpful. And they also test the security of all of your passwords and will let you know if you're duplicating them or you need to update them. It also allows you to share passwords securely with other people. If you tend to do that often, then the other person can also have that platform and it will facilitate secure sharing and they're fully encrypted. Another piece is two-factor authentication. I think the most secure is using one of those keys that go into your device, but just setting up two-factor does really help with security. I mentioned turning off your location tracking on your smartphone. Other things we can do, like a lot of people talk about doxing. If you're very public in the activism that you do, whether it's around abortion or other issues where people may want to try to find your personal information and use it against you, you can take some basic steps like making your social media accounts private. And you can also work on scrubbing your information, your personal information from online. So, open up a new like incognito or a separate browser than the one you typically use that doesn't have your search histories, and find all the places that your name or your personal information shows up. And you can work on systematically taking what you don't want to be public down. And there are also services like Delete Me that can be paid that help to scrub your information and then check routinely to make sure new information isn't coming up. Definitely want to try our best to avoid phishing and know the biggest red flags of phishing. Most are random. Most are kind of like casting a wide net. And many of us fall for them. And so just making sure we're taking the right steps to recognize when they're senders we don't recognize, or they're asking us to input our login information directly from an email, kind of basic things that are often red flags for phishing. And then the final tool I wanted to share is haveibeenpwned.com, which is basically a site where you can put in your email and they will pull up all the different sites that you have used that email in as a login that have had data breaches. And so that'll give you a really good sense of what information of yours may be out there, and then what passwords are in these like lists on the dark web that you need to update. So if you are in the practice of reusing passwords and you use that password on Canva, which had a data breach, then you now know that, dang, people may put that in my Bank of America account, or people may put that in my Gmail account and then gain access to other important accounts. And so it can just prompt you to update that information if you aren't using unique passwords for each of those sites. But if you are, then it'll just prompt you to update that site's information. I know I just threw a lot of things at people, a lot of information at people, but that was just a bit of a basically a teaser so that folks are aware of the different tools and opportunities we have for protecting our digital security. As Dartricia and as Naomi shared, we all have varying levels of risk, and we all have varying levels of appetite for inconvenience or the amount of work we want to put into protecting our digital security. But what's important to know is that there are a lot of ways that we can do this, some of which are very simple and easy to implement and put into practice. And that Digital Defense Fund has incredibly easy step-by-step guides that you can use to make these possible. And all of their information is open access. So they even have slide decks. So if you want to bring this to your organization to help coach people like I'm doing as a non-digital expert, then they have the information to allow you to do that. They even have a digital security zine that we can print out and distribute to folks to help them beef up their security as it relates to abortion, but also this really, is cross-cutting. So that concludes my section. I would love to just invite the speakers to come back on video and see if folks have any questions that they would like to bring to the group. I'm also pulling up the question feature. All right. We have some questions about SMA. I'll just read them aloud and let folks take it from there. So the first is there any concern with drug interactions, specifically with the misoprostol and maybe mifepristone pills?
Drug interactions with the pills and with themselves?
Taking them, if you're on other medicines. I know there are also some underlying health conditions that folks need to be aware of when taking pills. So that was a question.
I see. Yeah, depending on someone's medical history, there are some risks, and this is why sometimes folks will choose to either take both together or just one, which is why when receiving those pills themselves and determining which combination to use, it is really important to properly vet the information and to check in with one's medical history beforehand.
Yeah, and there are other things like do I have a history of ectopic pregnancy? Like, I mean, there are other things for people to be aware of. And that's especially when the red flags are important too, like to know if it wasn't successful or if something's going on with your body that may be out of the norm, in which case you would want to seek medical help. But those sites that folks have been sharing, the WHO, you can get more information about possible reasons why medication abortion may not be the best fit for someone. Can we spend some time giving examples and practicing talking about SMA and other options as just presented at the end of this time? I'm going to put that one on hold for a sec, just so we can get to the other questions, because that could take some time. Are there any certain apps that are worse for location sharing than others, or should we turn off location sharing altogether?
The app that I wrote in the chat is actually something that is helpful for this. I recognize that that's the opposite answer to the
Still
question.
good to have. That's a good resource. Do you want to say a little bit about that resource, Naomi?
Sure, yeah. So the app is for anyone who wants accurate, complete, unbiased information around sexual and reproductive health. And it is going to provide information on how to self-manage an abortion, if one is looking to support a friend through it. It has a customizable calendar that lets you track everything from bleeding to emotions. And then privacy is a huge priority. And so unlike other period tracking apps, it doesn't store any user data in the cloud. Data is only stored on the app in your phone, and no one else has access to it. And it comes to us from Women Help Women, which is a trusted and vetted organization.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. I've heard a lot of people talking about period tracking apps and the possibility of them being used against people, and yet they're incredibly useful in our lives. So it's great to have an example of an app that is not taking this information that we can use as like allowing us to have that important piece of information about our own reproductive health. And then related to the question around like, are certain apps worse? I personally can't speak to that, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say, just turn it off. Or at the very least, limit location tracking to when you are using the app. But for me, it's like, if I'm particularly concerned about the activities I'm doing, I would turn off my location tracking writ large. Because you just cannot be confident in what apps are using. And then if somebody were to get access to your phone, if they would be able to pull that information from a specific app. So I would just recommend turning it off. Other questions? And then I know there was the wanting to practice. I would say that is a great indication that you should join one of the upcoming trainings that Feminist Women's Health Center will be putting on, because you will be getting much more of that, an opportunity to deepen your skills and to practice with other folks who are also learning those. Does that sound correct, Naomi?
Yes, that does sound correct. It'll look like a little bit of a brief overview like we did today around like, hey, what's SMA? What are your legal rights? And then we'll have time with staff and our lead health promoters to practice through some common questions and situations that folks would often encounter in real time together.
Awesome. And this is also a really cool opportunity to like grab a friend, a trusted ally, a comrade and like present back what you learned today. Pull up the WHO website and start practice talking about these things, because we can talk about them. We can talk about the need for practicing. We can even do it one time in Zoom, but it really isn't until we're talking to people in our lives on a regular basis about these things that in the moment, we're then going to feel comfortable and informed and able to provide this information in an accurate and hopefully safe way. We have 1 minute. Any other questions or concluding thoughts from folks? Dartricia, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I'm just glad to be here and grateful to learn from y'all.
Same here. This has been so informative.
This has just been, yes, so informative. I feel like I was furiously looking up websites and like trying to get all the links together. So I'm really looking forward to getting those resources. And thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge and your energy. today. I think we're all so grateful.
Thank you all. There's one more skill building session after a short break from 3 to 3:15, and then we'll be concluding the summit with closing statements from Quadrille and Jackson. So see you all there.
Thank you.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.
Still a 10, still here, that's all me. Black love 2G. Damn.